Installing Active Directory. In this nugget, we'll be discussing installing Active Directory. And one of the first things you should really do before you go about installing Active Directory is to have a good plan for your domain naming. Do you need only a single domain? Do you need multiple trees? Do you need child domains? Any of that kind of stuff. So make sure you have a good plan for your domain naming. Generally, we try to keep the names simple and short as possible, and also so that they're relatively intuitive. Now, you might need child domains if you need to break things up according to various divisions, or you need to break up your replication strategy. We also will take a look at actually installing Active Directory, and we'll see that when you install Active Directory, if you don't have the appropriate DNS zone in place, that the Active Directory installation wizard can even offer to install it for you, and it does a pretty good job. And we'll talk about it removing Active Directory as well. That's pretty simple because it uses the same wizard. You just answer a few questions to remove it. You need to understand what's going on there, especially with global catalogs when you remove an Active Directory domain controller. And then we'll also talk about installing an Active Directory domain controller using removable media, which is very handy if you have slow or unreliable WAN links. You know, when it comes to your Active Directory namespace, it's really inextricable with the DNS namespace that you have because, of course, they're interdependent upon one another. I mean, you have to have DNS zone for an Active Directory namespace, which differs from our old NT4 domains where we just had a flat namespace. Now we depend upon DNS for our domains. Now, let's take a look at this diagram to kind of help us along with how we can name our domains. There's just some different ideas. We'll use this as a springboard as much as anything else. Now, what I like to do is to start off with just a single domain like we have here, nuggetlab.com. And the first advantage of that is simplicity, and this is going to work especially well in smaller to medium-sized organizations. Now, I do know of some large organizations that also use a single domain, and that can be commendable. But there just depends upon which company you're working with, what your political nature is of the people inside of your company, what your replication requirements are, what your security requirements are, and all of that. There's no right or wrong answer for that in many cases. There are some good reasons for keeping a single domain. For example, I don't want to keep a single domain just for sake of simplicity. I mean, here I have a single set of domain admins, a single set of enterprise admins, although hopefully it'll be a small group of people that's inside that membership. I have an easy-to-manage namespace. It's not, west.phoenix.nuggetlab.com or anything else like that where I have children of children of children of children domains and that kind of thing. So it's very easy to work with in that respect. Also, Active Directory can store millions of different objects. Nobody's filled up Active Directory quite yet. So it is quite robust in terms of the number of objects that it can contain. Those of you who've come possibly from NT4 domains might be used to just having a domain of your own name for whatever region you live in or whatever city or department or something like that. And sometimes we just have to stick with that because management has told us to. Also, as far as administrators are concerned, sometimes administrators want to keep their own domain because they want to have control of their own little, their fiefdoms. I mean, we're administrators. We kind of like to have the power that we have. So we like to have control of our own little kingdom there and our own domains. Well, if you stay with a single domain and you're not the enterprise admin in this nuggetlab.com domain, that doesn't mean that you can't do the stuff that you used to do within your own domain under NT4, for example. You can still create user accounts, create computer accounts, do anything you need to with them, delete them, reset passwords, do all the stuff that administrators normally do and more. You can create group policy objects and a whole bunch of different stuff that we'll be talking about throughout this whole series within a single domain, and we'll do that by delegating control over specific organizational units. So then I might just have this single domain. Now the first domain that I create in the forest is going to be called the forest root domain, and this might be the only domain I ever have. On the other hand, you can use it for other things as well. Sometimes you will create an empty root. This can be called an empty root, which means that you don't create any additional, or not many, additional user or computer accounts, or you don't create many organizational units up here. You pretty much keep it as thin and as empty as you can because you can put all your accounts into child domains over here. Sometimes you'll also hear this called a placeholder domain, or you might also hear it called a dedicated forest root domain. And one reason why we would do that is because we will then be able to manage the entire forest from a centralized staging location here that will affect our children domains here as well. For example, there are certain decisions that you make at the forest that you don't make in the child domains, such as something relating to the schema. If you need to add a particular item to the schema, particular attribute, well, that's something that you do on a forest-wide basis. So if I add some new item to my user accounts that's in the schema, it's going to affect not only this domain, but also any of the child domains I also have, any other domains I have in the entire forest. So that kind of decision I might want to stage from this forest root up at the top. Now then, when do you decide to branch out and to go into child domains? Well, I say you try to stay with that single domain when you can, except for when it no longer meets your requirements. Some of those requirements might be political. Maybe I've got somebody here in New York, a higher level manager who doesn't really even understand IT, but he says, we've always had our own domain here in New York, and we're going to keep our own domain here in New York. And that's the way it's going to be. Well, that's a political argument, and if he's the one that signs your paycheck, that's just what you're going to do. There may be also times when you're just trying to consolidate old NT4 domains, and you, for the time being, have to keep it a separate name, and then maybe later on you can use third-party tools or whatever, or the Active Directory migration tools from Microsoft to take all your user and group accounts and your computer accounts down here in New York and eventually collapse them into the nuggetlab.com domain. But for now, you still need this child domain. Another reason why we might want to go ahead and go into child domains and to make this forest root domain separate is because the enterprise admin security group in the enterprise root is a very powerful security group. And anybody who's a member of that group will have total control over any child domains. Well, we might want to separate out that power in this separate domain up here at the top and make sure that we very strictly limit the membership in that specific group. And then we can help to split up our administration a little bit better that way as well. Now, for the most part, however, any of these domains that we have, any domain you have, for normal day-to-day administrative responsibilities that any administrator will do, you'll never notice the difference, whether you're an enterprise admin up here or a domain admin down here. Enterprise admins typically only perform their function on rare occasions, anytime they need to add something to the schema or anytime they need to make a change to the whole Active Directory design through. But again, that's never very often a day-to-day basis. Now, other reasons why we might want to keep child domains or to create child domains are if we have different security requirements. What if here in Phoenix we have a top secret research and development lab and we want to have different password requirements on our users down here in Phoenix? Well, we want them to have, say 8-character passwords, whereas every place else they can have 7-character passwords. Well, if that's the case, that's supposed to be a 7. Anyway, if we have 7-character passwords everywhere else, then we will have to have different domain down here in Phoenix because the password policy is specific to a domain. And if that's the only thing that's holding me back, but it's not flexible, cannot change, I'm going to have to create my own domain down here. Now, I'll tell you one thing you shouldn't do, and that is to create a child domain just on the basis of a special project you have going on or some kind of a department or something like that. For example, over here where I've got newyork.nuggetlab.com, maybe it was newyork.nuggetlab.com. Maybe I had a special project, and it would be project1.nuggetlab.com. Well, what happens when this project is over? I've still got users that are working here. I've still got computer accounts. And now it doesn't make any sense to leave them in project1.nuggetlab.com. So you shouldn't name your domains after special projects or, if possible, even after certain departments. Instead, for your departments, you can now use organizational units to split those up, and it also gives you more power because we now also have group policy objects to more specifically control what happens with those organizational units and with what those users and computers are capable of. Now let's also address another situation, and that is what happens when you have two namespaces that are second-level namespaces. For example, nuggetlab.com, cbtnuggets.com. Well, it could be that these two companies were totally distinct companies having nothing to do with one another, and then there's a merge that takes place. Now what you have to do is you can set up what's called a forest trust relationship, so that even though these two domains and these two trees and forests initially had nothing to do with one another, you can create two one-way trust relationships here so that each one of these domains at the root of the forest trust one another, and then intrinsically it will establish trust throughout both of these entire forests to one another, so you can exchange resources back and forth even between these child domains. That's a new feature on Windows Server 2003. We'll talk about that in more detail on how to do that a little bit later on, but that is another possibility that you could do. Another thing you could do is if these two companies were related to one another. I mean, we set up nuggetlab.com, and when we set this up, we already owned cbtnuggets.local. We already knew that they were going to be part of our organization, that they were going to need to print to printers in New York and access file shares in Phoenix, and back and forth, so on and so forth here. Well, what we can do then is to create this root of this forest right here, and then we can go keep building our child domains, but when it comes time to building up the first domain control over at cbtnuggets.local, we will just promote this domain controller, and we will tell it during the installation wizard, which we'll see after a while here, we'll tell it that we want it to join an existing forest right here. Start a new tree, that's what this is all, a new tree, but in an existing forest. And then it's going to create a two-way trust relationship right here between these two roots of these two different trees, and this tree is going to be part of this forest, even though it's part of a separate namespace. And if you can do it that way, that's much more elegant than creating them separately and then manually creating two one-way trusts between the two forests. Make it one forest in the first place, if at all possible. Now, another thing to think about here is to name your child domains not according to cities, but to name them instead according to what their purpose is, or something like this. For example, here we've got phoenix.nuggetlab.com. Well, what if we move that office down to Tucson? Then what? Now we've got a Phoenix domain in Tucson. It just gets to be a little bit confusing for the users and everything. So maybe I should have named that instead headquarters. Instead of naming this, Los Angeles.cbtnuggets.local, we could name it hq.cbtnuggets.local, and that way, if we move it, it doesn't really make any difference. Same with this one over here, branch. Instead of putting it in, Tombstone, Arizona, we just call it branch because we might be moving it to Bisbee, Arizona, which is another sprawling metropolis in the southern desert of Arizona. Anyway, now we also have a domain up here that's cbtnuggets.local, and we also have a public internet presence that's cbtnuggets.com. Well, why can't I just have cbtnuggets.com over here? Well, you can, and there are a lot of bind implementations where you can do something like that, such that you have kind of two distinct databases where one part of your network will read one database, the other part of a network, such as the public internet, will read another part of the database. One will read private records, one will read public records, but it gets to be a confusing kind of a mess, and it can get to be a little bit more involved than we really want. And Microsoft doesn't recommend that you have the same name both externally for your public domain as well as internally for your private domain. So that is against Microsoft recommendations. Instead, they recommend exactly what we have here, something like this anyway, where you have two different names. You can have cbtnuggets.com out here and cbtnuggets.local in here, and then you have your DNS servers that host this zone, which are not available to the internet. Besides, the .local top-level domain namespace is not a public domain namespace on the internet, so it's not resolvable from the internet, kind of like private IP addresses are not resolvable from the internet. Now let me also point out something that people have misdocumented, and that is that you can use cbtnuggets.com internally and cbtnuggets.com externally in your public namespace. And they say that you can do that by using Microsoft's DNS and using Microsoft's conditional forwards to make that work. Well, first of all, let me get ahead of ourselves a little bit here and talk about a slightly off-topic issue, and that is conditional forwards. That states that I can use my DNS server right here that hosts cbtnuggets.local. Let's just start with that, how it's supposed to work. And let's say that I'm trying to find a host in nuggetlab.com. Well, I can configure a conditional forward on this DNS server that says, hey, anytime someone queries for nuggetlab.com, we're going to send them immediately over to a DNS server that hosts nuggetlab.com, and then we're going to have that server answer the query for nuggetlab.com. And that's how a conditional forward is supposed to work. And what's the advantage of that? Well, without this conditional forward going on here, what would have to happen otherwise is this DNS server would say, nuggetlab.com, have no idea who that is. So I'm going to go out to the internet, and I'm going to start with the root level DNS servers out here on the internet. And the root levels will then take us to a top-level domain, which would be, let's say, again, a .com server. And then the .com server would say, oh, nuggetlab.com, I do or I do not know any nuggetlab.com. Now, you see, if this nuggetlab.com is a private namespace, then nobody on the Internet's going to know, and then I'm just going to get a no answer back through here until I finally get the answer that there is not an answer for this, a proper answer for this, out there on the Internet. And then the query goes nowhere. We would call that then a negative query, or negative answer to the query. Well, conditional forwards would have sent it directly to my private DNS server, which would have been able to resolve it for me. Now, what they're saying in this documentation, and you'll see there's many places, and it's incorrect, let me tell you, is that you can use .com internally here, and then when one of your clients here tries to find a web server, let's say it's in my DMZ out here, a web server for cbtnuggets.com out there on the public network, on the public internet, what they're saying is that you can use a conditional forward for any names that are not resolved here in cbtnuggets.com to immediately go out here to this DNS server out on the public internet for cbtnuggets.com. That is flatly wrong. And the reason why I think that's been misdocumented is it looks like it'll work. I mean, you go through DNS and you can try to configure it that way, and it works all the way up until you click on OK. And I think possibly the authors of the documentation that have stated that you could do this have gone all the way up through to the point where they click OK and they say, oh, well, it looks like everything worked OK, so now I'll click on cancel. But if they had gone ahead and gone through and clicked OK, it would have bombed out on them, giving them an error message saying that they can't do that. And the bottom line is here, on a DNS server, Microsoft DNS server, I cannot create a conditional forward for a domain, for a zone, for which I'm already hosting it on that same DNS server. Now, in a Microsoft implementation, possibly one of the other things I could do, and this is still a little bit sloppy and not recommended by Microsoft, but using Microsoft DNS, not using Bind or any split horizon solutions, I could continue to create cbtnuggets.com internally here, cbtnuggets.com externally over here, and then what I would do is make sure that this DNS server is only available to my private host within my own organization here, and then it's not publicly accessible to the internet. In fact, at the firewall, I'll probably block TCP and UDP 53 to or from this DNS server. And then, in order to make my public resources available, like www servers, my FTP servers, maybe my mail servers, they're out here in the DMZ and available to the public network out on the internet. In order to make them available, I'll take their host records or their CNAMEs or whatever other resource records I need, and I will just manually put them into this DNS server over here so that when someone tries to query against this DNS server from my FTP server, well, then they'll have an IP address that resolves to it, and they'll be able to go directly to it through this firewall. But again, a little cumbersome and not recommended by Microsoft, so let's try to avoid that if we can. And then having cleaned up here, let me point out another thing you can do. You might have a political battle somewhere where somebody says, you must have .com in your internal network. Well, I can't have .local then, can I? So I'm going to have .com here. What else could I do then? Well, I would recommend that you make this a child domain, such as corp.cbtnuggets, corp, that's what that's supposed to say, corp.cbtnuggets.com. And you can make a child DNS namespace like this. This is a child DNS namespace. You can make that the top of a tree like this. It doesn't have to be only cbtnuggets.com, cbtnuggets.local. It can be a DNS child, which is still the top of an Active Directory forest or the top of an Active Directory tree. Now, this would certainly be valid. Now, when it comes to actually installing a domain controller, and for this purpose, we're going to assume that we're going to install the first domain controller at the root of a forest, and I'm going to install cbtnuggets.local in this case. All right. Now, doing that can be done from either a run command. You just go to click Start, Run, and then you can type DC promo, as in DC Promotion Wizard. Or you could also do this from a command line. It doesn't matter, DC promo. You can do it that way as well. It doesn't really matter. And then finally, you can also do it through the Manage Your Server item. You recognize this. This is what pops up the first time you log on to Windows Server 2003. And you click over here to add or remove a role. Once we click on that, it's going to make sure that we have everything connected because there might be certain prerequisites to making sure certain kinds of services will be able to start by making sure that the hardware is all in place. Then we'll click on Next. And after it confirms that it's got everything it needs for specific kinds of roles, I'll say, hey, I need to make this an Active Directory domain controller. So I'll select this item, go ahead and click on Next, and then it's going to go ahead and start a wizard for me when I click on Next again. And this starts then the Active Directory installation wizard. So we'll click on Next to get started with this wizard where we get an operating system compatibility warning message about down-level clients like Windows 95 or NT4 Service Pack 3 or earlier. You see, the problem with those operating systems is they're not capable of SMB signing or secure channel encryption or signing. SMBs are what we use. It's a kind of it's a protocol that's used to identify shares on a server. So I have to have signed SMBs to authenticate that both parties are indeed who they say they are, and I don't have anybody impersonating or any malicious users trying to intercept themselves into my network and intercept packets. Because since they have to sign the packets, well, then I can identify who my valid parties are. Well, these older clients can't do that with SMB signing. And they can't do secure channel encryption or signing either, which is what can be used to set up a secure channel for communication between the client and those domain controllers. And if they're not capable of setting up that secure channel, then they can never log on. So those are big issues with these older clients, and you're going to have to work with that. If you do have these older clients, of course, the best thing to do is to upgrade, or at least get the later service packs on NT4. Or the other thing you could do is, and it's not recommended, but you could weaken security on the Windows Server 2003 server so that it doesn't have any longer SMB signing or secure channel encryption and signing. That's not a recommended practice, however, because it makes it less secure. But anyway, we'll go ahead and click on Next, assuming that we have clients that can support this Windows Server 2003 domain, and we're going to make this a domain controller for a brand new domain, and we're not going to add an additional domain controller for an existing domain. We'll do that a little bit later on. We're just starting from scratch. Let's say we just started a brand new company at cbtnuggets.local. We'll go ahead and click on Next here, and since it's a brand new company, the first domain we're installing, it's going to be the first domain in a brand new forest. We're not adding a child domain to an existing domain tree, and we're not adding a domain tree in an existing forest. We're working with a brand new domain, brand new forest. We're going to enter in the name of the domain here. We'll make this cbtnuggets.local and click on Next, and it's going to hourglass me briefly here while it looks for that domain, looks for that zone on a DNS server. Now, I do have a configured DNS server, but my DNS server doesn't know anything about cbtnuggets.local. So we're going to see here in a little while the result of that. It's going to show us kind of an error in a little bit because it wasn't able to find it. And then for backwards compatibility, it'll also give us cbtnuggets as just a flatnet BIOS name, which is what NT4 clients are used to seeing and down-level clients are used to seeing. We'll go ahead and click on Next here, and it asks us to put a location for the database and the log folder. Now, Microsoft's official answer is that you should store these on separate hard disks, and for performance purposes, I don't really think that that's the case anymore, because hard disks are very large, and they're relatively fast nowadays, and for any smaller to medium-sized organization, you're probably going to be okay if you store it locally. If you have a very large organization with thousands or even tens of thousands of users, then yeah, you probably want to put it on a separate location. Now, for our purposes, I'm just going to leave it where it is. Now, the other thing you could consider with that is to at least put the database folder and the log folder on different hard drives, and that way you can have some redundancy there, or not redundancy, but so that way you can have the ability so that if one drive fails, let's say this database folder drive fails, and you put this on, let's say, drive D instead for the log, then at least you have a log file that remains intact. Or if the log file drive goes down, then at least you still have the actual database intact. By the way, you don't have to put either one of these on an NTFS volume, although it only makes sense. You should always use NTFS. I don't really care what anybody says. Just use NTFS. It's more secure, it has better failing, it has better ability to recover from failure, and it's pretty much just the standard that we use now in current operating systems. Also, you do need to have about a gigabyte of space to install Active Directory, even though the actual wizard here is only going to require about a minimum of 200 megabytes of space for the Active Directory database, which will be a file called ntds.dit, and about 50 megabytes for the log files. So we'll go ahead and click on Next, and in this case, we do need an NTFS volume to store the sysvol volume, and you see the default location here. Now, the sysvol is going to store things such as logon scripts and startup scripts. It's going to store things such as certain group policies. That kind of thing will be stored in sysvol, and it will replicate that around to other domain controllers that I have. This is going to be a shared system volume that must be available in the domain. So we'll go ahead and click on Next past this as well. By the way, after you install the Active Directory on this domain controller, you'll have to reboot the computer. And upon rebooting, you may get an error message early after rebooting where it will tell you that there was a problem in the event log that you should look at. Very often it's going to be the fact that it was not able to prepare the sysvol in time to identify this as a domain controller. That's an innocuous message, and it appears probably half the time. If you reboot it again, you probably would not see that same error message. The first thing it does, by the way, it really is going to require a couple of replication cycles for it to be able to identify this sysvol to the rest of the network if you have multiple domain controllers. In other words, if this was another peer domain controller, for example. And that's because the first replication is going to just update the other domain controllers that there is a new sysvol here, and then the second replication cycle will actually take anything that I have here and send it out to my other domain controllers. Now, as we're working with a single domain controller to begin with here, we'll just go ahead and leave everything the way it is. Everything should work just fine, except for, again, that innocuous message that we might get early on that was not able to prepare the sysvol in time. And then we get to our diagnostic results. This is where, remember, we had the hourglass that appeared when I clicked on Next after I typed in cbtnuggets.local and clicked Next. We had an hourglass for a while there. Well, I was trying to find the zone for cbtnuggets.local, couldn't find it. And that's exactly what it's telling me here is the DNS zone authoritative for the domain cbtnuggets.local cannot be updated because it is the DNS root zone. So in other words, what it was telling me is it went out to the internet to this root server out here to try to find cbtnuggets.local, and we could not update that on a root server. I mean, after all, the internet is not going to allow me to update these servers with my own zone. So what we've got here then is we got one of three choices. We can correct the problem and perform the DNS diagnostic test again. That means I can leave the wizard open, and then I can go and manually configure DNS here or on some other DNS server where I'm currently pointing. And if I do an ipconfig all here, I see that I'm currently pointing to 10.10.10.4 for my DNS server. And I can tell you, you don't have to look at it, but I can tell you that that DNS server does not have any knowledge of cbtnuggets.local. But I could create the cbtnuggets.local zone over on that DNS server, and then once I'd done that, immediately come back here, select this option, I've corrected the problem, and then click Next. Or I could choose, I will correct the problem later by configuring DNS manually, and that might be where I configured on some other server or on this server after I've installed Active Directory, and then manually configure DNS, which is a little bit more problematic, involves a lot more work, and I would have to make sure that I get the appropriate records updated in the DNS server. Or I could do this option, which is probably the most preferred option. And this means that I'm going to install and configure DNS on this computer, which is very often a good idea to make your domain controllers also DNS servers, because it's not so much additional work that it's going to overwhelm that server, and the Active Directory will depend upon DNS, so you might as well keep that DNS query local instead of having to send it out to other locations. So I'm going to set up DNS on this local server and configure it to use this DNS server as the preferred DNS server, and then I'll click on Next. Now, once I've done that, I get another message here. Now let's go ahead and take a look at what this is really talking about. You see, back in NT4, I'd have maybe a laptop user dialing in from a hotel room to my RAS server right here. Well, the RAS server may have its own credentials on it. It may have user accounts on there if it's in like a work group membership or something like that. And then this laptop just has to validate against one of these local credentials. And then that's pretty much it. However, in most cases, as is the case with Windows Server 2003 as well, we're going to have a RAS server actually check the credentials on some other server, and that's going to be a domain controller, an NT4 domain controller, if we go back a few years to the years of NT4. Now, this NT4 domain controller will accept the ability for this RAS server to check against its credentials in the SAM, or the Security Accounts Manager database here locally, using null credentials, which means there's no username or password involved at all. This also means, then, that anybody, any malicious user, can also attach this domain controller remotely over the network and also do credential checking against this domain controller, which is a great way to do a brute force attack against user accounts and things like that. So you can see that that's very insecure, and we'd rather not have that. In any case, it authenticates the user if that's a valid username and password, sends the credentials, the fact that the user is valid, back to the RAS server, and the RAS server allows that person to log on. But you can see how insecure this is. Well, what we're trying to do here with this checkbox, or this radio button, is to make it compatible with only Windows 2000 Windows 2003 operating systems, and this means that it's no longer going to allow that kind of permission capability, no longer going to allow null credentials, which means that anonymous users can read the information. So if we had NT4 RAS servers and we had to allow people to log on using those NT4 RAS servers to check the credentials, I'd have to select this radio button. That's not a good thing. Now, the better thing to do then is to, before you even upgrade your first domain controller to Windows NT4 to Windows Server 2003, better to upgrade your RAS servers first so that they're Windows Server 2003 RAS servers, or even Windows 2000 would be okay. Windows 2000 would also work with this. And then after you've upgraded the RAS server, then upgrade the domain controllers to Windows Server 2003, and you'll be okay with this because then you can use this more stringent security. And by the way, what makes this less secure is what it does is it adds the Everyone group and the Anonymous Logon group to the pre-Windows 2000 compatible access built-in group. And once it does that, that's what's going to allow those null credentials. By selecting this button, we will not be performing that action. Okay, then we can go ahead and enter in a restore mode password. This will not be the administrator account. You notice that it mentions the administrator account here. This is not the administrator account that is going to be stored in Active Directory. That's the domain administrator account. Well, you see, you might have to boot into Directory Services Restore mode to do some troubleshooting with Active Directory. Thing is, when you boot into that mode, it doesn't actually load Active Directory. Therefore, you can't check credentials against the administrator account that's in Active Directory. So this is actually the local administrator account on the local machine on this domain controller. So you'll need to enter in a password that is suitable for that. Make sure that you make note of it and that you can remember it, or at least find the password later on if you do need to boot into Directory Services Restore mode. So we'll go ahead and click on Next here, and then this is just a summary, tells me everything that it's going to do. Notice that, once again, the DNS service will be installed and configured on this computer. A lot of us as administrators are pretty anal about every little detail that we do, and that's a good thing. That's a good quality to have as an administrator. However, as far as DNS is concerned, it's okay to let the system do this for you. It does a good job of installing the DNS service and providing just exactly what you need in order to be able to make it to work, and really is pretty much hands-free as far as DNS goes. And then once it's installed it, you can go back and tweak it or make little changes to it. But as far as functionality goes, it really works pretty well just the way it is. So then we'll go ahead and click on Next and allow the Active Directory installation wizard to complete its functions. And then it continues, and you see here that it's installing DNS. Now, I'd like to point out that if you have dynamically assigned IP addresses, that it's going to pause here actually right before this step, and it's going to pause there, and it's going to tell you that you should not use dynamically assigned IP addresses. Gives you an opportunity to enter in static addresses instead. And that's pretty much true of any kind of a server, file and print server, database server, web server, domain controller, just about everything, any kind of server, you should not normally assign them dynamic addresses. And then now when it's finished, it says it's completed the Active Directory installation wizard. If you had any trouble, if DNS didn't install for some reason or some other problem occurred, it would give you that message right here as well. Now, by the way, this also went a lot faster than what you're likely to see. It's just that I paused recording while I was hourglassing through this, so I could kind of give it in compressed time here. We'll go ahead and finish, and of course we're going to have to restart now because we have made a drastic change to this system. It's one of the few things that you do have to restart the system for. Many services, even like the DNS service that I installed, you don't have to restart the computer for, but something like this, we certainly would. So I'll restart this, and then I'll see you on the other side. Now here we've rebooted this system, and once we log back on again, it tells us that this server is now a domain controller. By the way, you don't get this if you don't use that Configure Your Server wizard to start DC Promo. If you just do it from a command line and type DC Promo from a command line, you don't get this once the system bounces and you reboot it. Now here we go ahead and click View the next steps for this role if you want to, and it just pretty much just opens the help file, gives you some additional tasks you can look at and stuff like that. I don't have to do that. And then you can also look at the server log, so you can click on that and identify what happened for this installation. For example, here you can see that a couple of other times offline here I decided to cancel the installation, and then finally we had it successfully set up here at the end. Now once that's done, that's really all there is to it. This is just kind of a courtesy to give you this information. They just click on Finish, and now you have a domain controller. Once you've got that, the manager's server interface that we again see here, which I usually just use this checkbox to never display it again because it kind of annoys me. Now you can go ahead and look at all these things. You can look at Active Directory users and computers, domains and trust sites and services. These are three tools relative strictly to Active Directory that you wouldn't get on a member server. And then you can also manage this DNS server as well. Alternatively, and what most administrators will do, is just to use administrative tools over on the Start menu to access those same tools. Now, if for some reason you need to remove Active Directory from a domain controller, and typically you're going to do this when you're totally decommissioning a domain. Maybe this is the last domain controller in that domain. Or it might simply be that I've got enough domain controllers and I need to repurpose this machine, this hardware, so that I can use it for something else, mail server, whatever else I need it to be. Now, in order to decommission this, I can again go to Start Run and type DC Promo, or go to Command Prompt and type DC Promo, or you can again use the Manager Server interface, and we'll just do this for the fun of it, and we'll just click Add or Remove a Role. Of course, this time we're going to remove a role, and this time it's going to be the domain controller role that we're going to be removing right here. So we'll select that role and click on Next. Then, of course, it tells us that we're going to remove Active Directory, and then I'll specify just to make sure that you don't do something carelessly, I have to proactively select a checkbox to remove the domain controller role, and then I'll just click on Next. And, of course, all it's really going to do is to, again, start DC Promo. And, by the way, I could have shown you this as well when we ran DC Promo initially by using the Configure Your Server wizard. But if you go to the Windows Task Manager, which I access just now by pressing Control-Shift and Escape on the keyboard, there's other ways of getting there as well. My point in pointing out this is that there's DC Promo right there. So it's really all that whole wizard, this fancy wizard thing in the background does for you is just launch the same thing you could have done from a command line. So next I'll click on Next, and then it tells me that this domain controller is a global catalog server. Global catalogs are critical in processing logon. So if I have other domain controllers in this same domain that are not yet global catalog servers, I should make them global catalog servers first, replicate all of my Active Directory data to them, and then I can continue with this server. Because, again, since it's a global catalog server, if I remove that role here, then I leave people with no way to log on to the domain if there are other domain controllers. And more information about global catalogs is covered elsewhere in this course as well. But in any case, we'll click OK here, and then we'll say this is the last domain controller in the domain if that's applicable, and I'll just go ahead and click on the checkbox there because that would be true in this case. Now, anything that depended upon the security accounts of this domain in order to be created will no longer be valid. So if you have a file share or an NTFS permission on a particular resource on, let's say, a file server somewhere, well, now you're going to have bare SIDs where you had user and group accounts from this domain in the past. Now it's just going to be bare SIDs. You might have seen those in the past. Those are where you simply have an S-1-5- a whole bunch of gobbledygook numbers, and it doesn't actually resolve to a name. That's because it can't anymore, because there's no domain controller to resolve that SID against. Then all of the user accounts will be deleted, all cryptographic keys will be deleted. So if you've got something like encrypting file system files or encrypted email or anything like that, you should decrypt it before you go on because you will not get this back. Especially the EFS encrypted files, there's no getting them back once you remove the encryption keys there. So we'll go ahead and click Next because we haven't done anything like that and we're ready to move on. Now this also has the last replica of the following application directory partitions. These are special partitions that can be created within Microsoft's own DNS and which are new in Windows Server 2003. In Windows 2000, we did not have the domain DNS zones and the forest DNS zones application directory partition. This relates to what kind of data is replicated within DNS. Although it's Active Directory data in DNS, you can more closely control the scope, whether you want it to go to the entire forest or to just the same domain that you're in. And we'll go ahead and allow these to be removed, and we'll go ahead and click on Next. And then we'll just delete all those application directory partitions on the domain controller. Now there's some kinds of application directory partitions that might have been configured by a third-party application or by some other function within Windows. You may need to remove those manually. For example, if you have a telephony API application directory partition, then you can use tappycfg.exe to remove those partitions, those application directory partitions. In any case, we'll go ahead and delete the application directory partitions and click Next, and then we'll have a new administrator password. This will be a new administrator password for the local administrator account on the system. So we'll go ahead and next past that, and then it's just going to give us a summary of what's going to go on. It's going to remove everything. Oh, big deal there. No guessing that. So we'll go ahead and click on Next now, and we'll see that it starts to remove everything. That's pretty much it. You can read the messages as they fly by. I'm going to, again, compress time on this and pause the recording in just a moment, and then after it reboots, I'll see you again. And then now, having returned to a reboot into Windows Server 2003 with Active Directory removed, we see that that's exactly what it says up here. The domain controller role is removed. And again, we won't see this unless we use the Manage Your Server wizard that we launched DC Promo with a moment ago. You can also, again, look at your Configure Your Server log, which is the Configure Your Server log right here. And we saw that earlier I had tried to remove it, and then I decided to cancel it. So we tried to do it and cancel it, and then here it was successfully removed. That's pretty much it. Click on Finish, and now you have a standalone server. And again, we have the Manager Server little interface here that I like to get rid of. Okay, now once we've done that, it's also going to clear out DNS, so if we had already had it automatically create a zone for cbtnuggets.local for us there, it's now going to empty that out. Now then, there are a couple of other ways of installing Active Directory on a system. One of the ways you can do that is to use an automated answer file, and you can get a lot of information on this. We're not going to exhaust that because that is a lot of information. But if I go to a command prompt here and type ref.chm, you'll see that there's an installation reference here that has to do with all of these INF and SIF files that you can use for an automated installation. A lot of this is used for vendors. So, for example, some manufacturer that manufactures a lot of servers and sends them out with the operating system pre-installed might send something like Windows Bill of Materials INI file, which is what's useful in setting it up, and it uses it in conjunction with sysprep, which is another way of automating the installations. A lot of what we'll be doing, though, is to use unattend.txt files or winnt.sif files. And you can read this file. There's an awful lot in this. And in fact, you can start at the introduction, and then you can print it, and you can print out all of the subcontents as well. So in any case, a lot of information about that you can install using an answer file in that manner. Now, another option is especially useful if you have something like multiple domain controllers and multiple sites connected by perhaps slow or expensive WAN links. Maybe I've got a headquarters where I've got an Active Directory database that's several gigabytes in size, and yes, there are some out there for very large organizations. And then I've got a branch office, maybe it's a banking organization. I've got a branch office bank down in, Macon, Georgia, that's got a 128K WAN link to the main office. Well, I can't transmit gigabytes worth of data across that 128K WAN link and install Active Directory that way because it's just impractical in terms of the amount of time that it takes. Nevertheless, in Windows 2000, we had to do that. Now, in Windows Server 2003, you can run DC Promo with a /ADV switch, and then you can use restored backup data. And the backup data is system state data, which of course includes Active Directory. So you'll create a system state backup in your headquarters, and then you'll put it on a tape or on a CD or whatever it fits on, FedEx it down to that Macon, Georgia office, and then they will go ahead and run DC Promo ADV, and then they'll restore it using restored data from that CD or that backup on the local drive there. Then they will only use the WAN link to get any critical objects from the headquarters. It'll get anything that's new from the headquarters since the time that the backup was taken, and it'll also get any data in the sysvol folder that it needs to also replicate to the new domain controller, maybe a new policy, maybe a new script, that kind of thing. So of course, the data that it's going to get now, after it's having used the system state backup to restore most of the information to this new domain controller, is going to be substantially smaller across that 128K WAN link. Now, you also need to make sure that the backup that you use is less than 60 days old because there's something called a tombstone interval that controls how objects are deleted in Active Directory. And if it's got a tombstone lifetime, by default, of 60 days. And if you get a tape backup that's older than that, you can wind up with something called lingering objects, which are just kind of messy in Active Directory, difficult to clean up. So we'll keep a backup that's less than 60 days old, which you probably will have anyway as long as someone's been doing responsible backup of your system state. So now we're going to go ahead and restore our information. So we're going to go back to finding a backup. So we're going to go ahead and catalog the backup file that I've got on my CD-ROM over here, where I've shipped the data from a domain called AccuSource, and this is my system state data from AccuSource is the name of that domain. And what I want to do then is to go ahead and install an AccuSource domain controller here as well, using this system state backup. So I'm going to go ahead and expand this out, and by doing so, it's going to go ahead and catalog the system state data for me, and there it all is. Now I'll select that I want that system state data, which you see includes my Active Directory information. And by the way, you can't just restore only the Active Directory information. Notice that these are all grayed out, and that's because all of these things are interrelated with one another and dependent upon one another, so you can't really break it apart. So I'll go ahead and restore them to an alternate location, and I'll specify where that's going to be. I'll just call it AccuSource Backup, and I'll start the restore. Now here it says that it's not all the data is going to be restored. That's going to be okay for our current purposes because it will restore the Active Directory data, and that's all we really care about for the time being. So we'll click OK and allow it to restore the data, and I'll see you again when this is finished. All right, now I've finished restoring the data. Now I'm ready to go ahead and run DC Promo, but this time with the /ADV switch, which will enable it to look to the local hard drive for the system state data that I've restored from that backup. So I'll go ahead and run DC Promo, and some of these are the same, so I'll just kind of skip through the stuff that's the same. But here we have an additional domain controller for an existing domain, whereas last time we chose a domain controller for a new domain. Now we're also going to get this option because of the /ADV switch. We can designate a specific location on a local hard drive here to find for the restored system state backup, which I put in the AccuSource Backup folder. So I'll select that option there, click on Next, and then also that system state that I created was created or backed up from .net.accusource.local, and that happened to be a global catalog. Now, if the system state was made from a global catalog server, it also gives you this global catalog option because, of course, the global catalog information will be stored in that system state. So I'll go ahead and say, yeah, why not? Let's just go ahead and make it a global catalog. And the global catalog is critical for being able to find logon servers. And it's a forest-wide role. It's a forest-wide function that contains a replica of every object in Active Directory in the forest, not all of the contents of every object, not every attribute, but it contains every object throughout the entire forest. So anyway, global catalog is a pretty critical role. You're going to need more than one, so I'll go ahead and say yes, so that I have an additional one here. And then I'll enter in some credentials that will allow me to have permission to install Active Directory on this computer. Now, as soon as I click on Next here, I'm going to get a big problem. I'm going to get a red X. And the reason why is because I'm looking for AccuSource.local. However, if we look at my control panel, and then I go to my network properties down here, my network connections, and go to the properties of my active network connection, we'll see that in TCP/IP, its DNS server is 10.10.10.40, which is this server. Well, on this server, I've never configured an AccuSource.local zone. It's not even a secondary to a primary AccuSource.local zone. Therefore, this system has no way of identifying that zone or identifying that domain. So let's just go back to the wizard here. I'm going to click on Next, and we'll see that we're going to get that error, and in fact, there it is. And it kind of gives you a little clue here saying that it may be caused by a DNS lookup problem. Well, indeed, that is the problem in this case. So what I'll do is I'll just go right in here, and I can do this even while the wizard is still open. Change this to .4. And in fact, at this, I just see this one down here. I'm not going to really need for archaic purposes, so I'll go ahead and leave that empty. Anyway, I'm going to go to .4 to resolve AccuSource.local. The .4 server is a DNS server in the AccuSource.local zone, and it is available to me. So I'll go ahead and do that, and then I'll go ahead and click on Next. But before I do that, I first need to clear the cache. And this is slightly off topic, but will come in handy for situations like this. You see, I've already determined that I can't find AccuSource.local. Well, because of what we call negative caching in DNS, it remembers that it couldn't find it. Therefore, it never tries to find it again, or not for a period of time. So what I'm going to do is do an IP config. I'm going to tell it to forget that it couldn't find AccuSource.local by typing a /flush DNS. And then we'll go ahead and exit out of that. Now that I've flushed that out, when it tries to resolve AccuSource.local again this time, it will be able to use the configured DNS server to find it, and indeed now it lets me proceed through the wizard, and we've seen this before, so we'll just kind of next through everything from this point. And we'll go ahead and continue to click on Next, and now we'll click on Next, and this will take a little while, but when it's done, we will then have Active Directory installed on this server, and it will be a pure domain controller in AccuSource.local. And now here I've cut time down to the end where it's finished the installation, and this is going to be a lot lighter on network traffic because I might have just put in 10,000 users and computers from this backup using the ADV switch. And then when I restart this computer and it becomes a full domain controller, then it can use my 128K WAN link from Macon, Georgia to synchronize with my Active Directory domain controller maybe in Atlanta, my headquarters. And if we've created 25 accounts since the time that backup was made, that's all it's going to send across the wires, those 25 accounts, a lot easier to digest over a 128K link than I would have otherwise had. In this nugget, we took a look at installing Active Directory, and although it's fairly straightforward, you have to have some planning going into place first, and that is in your domain naming scheme. I mean, you want to keep your names fairly simple and as short as possible so that they're more intuitive, but you also need to determine, do you need more than one domain? Maybe you need child domains, and if you do need child domains, remember that you have to name those smartly as well. We try not to name those according to department, or worse yet, we try not to name those according to various projects, which are very susceptible to changing frequently. We also took a look at installing Active Directory using the DC Promo, or the Active Directory Installation Wizard as it's called, and we can do that through a command line or through Manage Your Server. And we also took a look at removing Active Directory, which you use the same wizard to do, which just kind of reverses the whole process, removes it for you. And then, very important item is to use media, and you can use a system state backup and restore that system state backup to a local hard drive, and then install Active Directory using that system state backup. And of course, that's very handy for sites where you might have a slow connection or a slow WAN link to a main office, for example. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.